the whisper beneath the stones. Some truths are not simply forgotten. They are entombed, folded beneath centuries like ancient roots beneath hardened soil, waiting not for time itself to pass, but for time to catch up. And now, as though summoned by some unseen convergence of mind, epic, and spirit, we find ourselves on the trembling cusp of revelation. What had been buried for 2,000 years, veiled behind ritual, symbol, and silence, has stirred once more. It emerges not as a dusty relic, but as a living pulse beneath the skin of modern reality, like a second heartbeat we had trained ourselves not to hear. There is something deeply unsettling, and yet profoundly familiar, about rediscovering a knowledge so old that it feels native, even ancestral, to the marrow. Imagine walking through a forest you've never visited, yet somehow knowing every turn of its path before it comes into view. The branches murmur your name. The wind carries memories you never made. This is the nature of the knowledge now unsealed. It is not new. It is the forgotten inheritance of a species that once saw itself mirrored in the cosmos, that built temples not merely of stone, but of meaning, cathedrals carved from consciousness itself. And now it has returned, or rather, we have turned again to face it. The phrase, "this knowledge was buried for 2,000 years," until now carries with it a tremor, as though the earth itself shuddered under the weight of its concealment. It hints not only at something hidden, but something deliberately veiled. A truth once known, then guarded, then lost in the layers of language, doctrine, and distraction. What if the veil was not torn, but thickened over time by our own forgetting? What if the silence that followed was not absence, but protection? This rediscovered wisdom, these unsealed truths, are not secrets in the modern sense. They are not tricks or codes waiting to be cracked. They are not conspiracy. They are reality seen through a different lens, one more ancient than our modern skepticism, yet more advanced than our present intellect dares imagine. It is the kind of knowledge that speaks not to the facts we gather, but to the framework in which all facts rest. It is about knowing how to see not just what is seen. To approach it, we must shift from mind to metaphor, from logic to lens. This journey does not unfold like a map with destinations marked, but like a constellation. Stars scattered across the velvet of perception, drawing meaning only when seen in sacred alignment. What we are recovering is not just history but orientation, a celestial compass to navigate the vast terrain between being and becoming. 2 millennia ago, certain teachings were buried not just beneath time, but beneath language. They were encoded in myth, in parable, in geometry, in sacred architecture and ritual gesture. These teachings whispered of the divine architecture within all things, that the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, that man and universe are twin spirals of the same ineffable dance. They taught that truth was not a doctrine, but a pattern, a living rhythm woven into breath, body, and cosmos alike. Why now? Why does this knowledge rise again from the shadows of forgotten catacombs and untranslated scrolls? Perhaps because the world itself has reached a threshold. The old frameworks crack beneath the weight of contradiction. We are saturated with information yet starved of meaning. We hold devices that connect continents but sever our inner sense of direction. In this dissonance, the buried truths begin to hum. A frequency not heard with ears but with soul, vibrating awake a part of us long anesthetized. These are not simple truths. They do not comfort the ego, nor do they yield to surface understanding. They ask us to unlearn, to listen, to reweave the world with symbolic awareness and reverence. They ask us to remember not just facts, but our original function as bridges between the seen and the unseen, the finite and the infinite. This is not a mere historical curiosity. It is a reorientation of the human compass. To engage with these unsealed truths is to crack the shell of our current paradigm and glimpse what lies beneath. A deeper, older structure of knowing, where thought bends into mystery and time loops back to wisdom once discarded. The knowledge buried for 2,000 years does not belong to the past. It belongs to the edge of the present, to the place where myth and science, heart and mind, converge into clarity. And so we begin, not as archaeologists of crumbling empires, but as mystic cartographers, charting the reemergence of an ancient intelligence long mistaken for silence. We begin not with certainty, but with surrender, to awe, to inquiry, to the dance between meaning and metaphor, the axes of reality, awakening the forgotten lattice. As we journey deeper into the contours of what has been unsealed, we begin to perceive that this knowledge, buried for 2 millennia, was never merely a collection of facts or a treatise of mystical conjecture. It is an architecture of perception, a hidden scaffolding behind the visible theater of life, like the faint glimmer of stars beneath daylight's brilliance. These truths were preserved not to guard power, but to protect coherence. Their essence lies not in what they say, but in how they transform the one who listens. The core of these teachings revolves around a series of guiding principles, threads so fundamental that they are woven into the very grammar of existence. To name them is to risk confining them, yet to ignore them is to drift in a sea of surfaces without ever touching depth. These are not rules, but rhythms, like the ocean's pull beneath the tide, shaping the shoreline invisibly. One of the first rhythms we encounter is the law of correspondence, echoed in the ancient adage, "As above, so below." This is not poetic indulgence. It is ontological architecture. The spiral of galaxies mirrors the spiral of the nautilus shell, just as the branching of trees echoes the bronchi of the lungs. The self is not an isolated entity, but a miniature of the macrocosm, a reflection of the universe compressed into the vessel of flesh and thought. Within this perspective, divinity is no longer remote, but enfolded into every blade of grass and flicker of emotion. What was buried was not a doctrine, but a remembering that everything is connected, organically, symbolically, energetically. Alongside this arises the law of vibration. All that exists moves, and this movement is not chaos but cadence. Frequency is the hidden language of the universe. Emotions are frequencies, thoughts are waves, sound shapes matter. Every tradition that ever whispered sacred syllables into cavernous temples knew this. Words are not merely tools of communication, but instruments of creation. The power of language lies not in its literal meaning, but in its resonant intention. To speak is to sculpt reality. Then there is the forgotten current of the law of polarity, where modern thought often dichotomizes light and dark, good and evil. This principle unveils a dance, not a battle. Opposites are not enemies but reflections of a single spectrum, a unified axis experienced from different poles. Heat and cold are degrees of the same essence. Joy and sorrow are the rise and fall of the same wave. Understanding this allows one to move beyond the tyranny of dualism into the sanctuary of balance. The initiate learns not to resist the shadow, but to illuminate it, and in doing so to integrate wholeness. The law of rhythm follows, subtle yet all-encompassing. Life is cyclical. Planets orbit, tides rise and fall, civilizations ascend and recede. Our personal lives mirror this eternal pulse. Seasons of growth, contraction, reflection, expansion. The buried knowledge does not seek to eliminate suffering but to attune us to its timing, to show us the sacredness in every stage of becoming. With this awareness, we no longer curse the winter of our lives, but recognize it as soil preparing for spring. And finally, perhaps the most concealed truth is the law of mentalism, that all is mind. Reality is not objective stone carved by chance, but a living thought form, a great dream woven by a cosmic intelligence. This does not mean the world is illusion in the dismissive sense, but that it is Maya, a mask, a reflection of inner dimensions made visible. The implication is profound, that to change the world, one must begin with the mind, not with force, but with intention, clarity, vision. These laws are not commands. They are invitations. They describe the inner workings of a living system that we are not separate from but deeply entangled with. And as one engages with these truths, not merely intellectually but viscerally, a transformation begins. The mind shifts from being a consumer of the world to a participant in its unfolding. But beyond these philosophical frameworks lies something more intimate, more radical. The buried knowledge insists that we are more than witnesses to reality, we are co-creators. The world responds not just to our actions, but to the quality of our awareness. When the ancient temples aligned their columns with stars, they were not just architects. They were alchemists of space and time, embedding meaning into matter, showing us that sacredness is not something found, but something made through intentional attention. Thus, the unsealed truths do not call us to worship ancient icons or mimic bygone rituals. They ask us to perceive with new eyes that remember the soul's geometry, the sacred patterning within every moment, to see the universe as alive, intelligent, participatory, to see yourself not as a fractured self, but as a node in a vast, harmonic web, where thought, feeling, symbol, and energy flow together in symphonic resonance. This reawakening is not esoteric detachment. It is precision vision. In a world where meaning feels often diluted, where reality seems increasingly mediated and hollowed, these ancient laws arrive like tuning forks, recalibrating us to the deeper song we had forgotten how to hear, the mirror of myth and the river beneath time. If the core themes of the unsealed truths form the architecture of a forgotten cathedral, then the symbolic narratives handed down through ages are its stained glass windows, radiant, fragmented, yet alive with colored light. Each story is not just a tale, but a portal. Each symbol is not just a metaphor, but a seed of meaning planted in the fertile soil of the unconscious. Through myth, ritual, and allegory, this ancient knowledge clothed itself in forms the soul could drink like wine, slowly, richly, without the interference of reason's rigid teeth. In these stories, we begin to trace the contours of a deeper language, one not spoken but dreamt, not learned but remembered. For the truths buried 2,000 years ago did not vanish. They hid themselves in plain sight, in the archetypes that repeat across cultures and epochs. These are not mere coincidences. They are echoes of a cosmic memory encoded into the collective human psyche. Let us step into one such story, worn smooth by time yet never dulled, the myth of the phoenix. Across Egypt, Persia, and early Christian Gnostic thought, the phoenix burns in its own flame and rises again from its ashes, not as a creature of fantasy, but as a living metaphor for transformation. This bird is not just a symbol of death and rebirth. It is a teaching, a whisper, that every collapse is pregnant with resurrection, that the self you believe to be permanent must occasionally turn to ash for your deeper self to emerge, winged and radiant. In this tale, the fire is not the end, but the passage. Pain is not punishment, but initiation. Another tale breathes from the shadows of ancient Greece, yet echoes through all spiritual traditions. The journey of Persephone into the underworld. Taken from the surface world and plunged into darkness, she becomes not a victim, but a sovereign queen of depth. This descent mirrors the path of anyone who seeks truth, not truth as an accumulation, but truth as descent. One must leave the light of consensus reality and descend into the unseen. Only there, in the underworld of one's own unconscious, does the real harvest begin. These myths were not simply entertainment for ancient minds. They were keys. Ritual dramas reenacted in Eleusinian mystery schools were not theater. They were transformation. Participants did not merely watch the descent and return of Persephone. They became her. They journeyed through symbolic death to be reborn as more than citizens, reborn as souls in active communion with the divine. This is what the unsealed truths point to, that life, rightly understood, is not linear but initiatory. Every loss, every rupture, is part of a sacred pattern encoded in the fabric of being. Consider also the alchemical image of the Ouroboros, the serpent swallowing its own tail. It loops eternally, devouring and birthing itself in a single gesture. This is the symbol of totality, of cycles unbroken, of unity that contains its own apparent opposites. In Hermetic thought, it whispered of immortality, not of the body but of consciousness. The Ouroboros teaches that the beginning is in the end, and that the path forward is also a return to origin. It is the infinite returning to itself not as repetition, but as evolution through spiral. And what of the labyrinth, so often misunderstood as a maze? The ancient labyrinth is not a puzzle to escape, but a path to follow. One road in, one road out. In myth, it is the domain of the Minotaur, the monstrous hidden self, guarded at the heart of our own interior fortress. To walk the labyrinth is to move inward toward encounter, and then outward toward integration. Theseus does not slay the beast for glory. He does so to reclaim the light exiled in darkness. The story tells us, face what is buried, and through that confrontation, become whole. These symbolic stories offer more than metaphor, they are maps. Their landscapes mirror the terrain of human development, from unconscious innocence to conscious integration. In their symbols, we meet aspects of ourselves we did not know we had forgotten. Notions of masculine and feminine, light and shadow, ascent and descent, all take on living form. They show us that transformation is not an abstract concept, but a mythic reality played out in the human soul across lifetimes and generations. To retrieve these buried narratives is to participate in a healing of imagination. For what was sealed away was not merely data, but the ability to see the world as alive with symbolic coherence. Modern eyes, trained on surfaces, have lost this capacity. But these myths restore it, not by appealing to belief, but by activating the ancient pattern recognition system of the psyche itself. Every society that thrived beyond the material left us these stories. And in doing so, they left us instructions, not for surviving, but for becoming. Becoming the bridge between heaven and earth, between matter and mind, between time and the eternal now. So we are not merely reading myths, we are remembering ourselves. These stories are not about something that happened long ago. They are happening now, inside you, inside the collective unfolding of humanity. The knowledge buried for 2,000 years was never about worshiping the past. It was about anchoring the timeless. Through these symbolic narratives, we glimpse the architecture of meaning behind experience, and the possibility that each of us is, in some deep sense, an unspoken myth awaiting our own conscious telling. The geometry of daily awakening. There comes a moment when the soul, having wandered through the caverns of forgotten myths and stood at the precipice of cosmic law, must return, must descend, not down into shadow this time, but into the realm of errands and traffic lights, deadlines and digital noise. The sacred must touch the secular. The stars must walk barefoot through the kitchen. This is the real alchemy. Not retreat into ethereal abstraction, but integration into the bloodstream of everyday life. To take the truths once buried and apply them means not merely to think differently, but to become differently. And in this becoming, the ordinary is not discarded, it is transfigured. The ancient idea of the temple was never about bricks or borders. It was about presence, about the way one enters a space not just with feet but with intention. The temple is the quality of attention we bring to the moment. Washing dishes with mindfulness becomes a kind of prayer. Speaking gently becomes a sacrament. Silence, instead of emptiness, becomes a chalice. The rhythm of these ancient laws, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, mentalism, was never meant to be locked in esoteric manuscripts. They are the operating principles behind every choice, every reaction, every relational ripple. To live them is to develop a different kind of intelligence, not merely emotional or intellectual, but symbolic. This symbolic intelligence begins to perceive patterns in chaos, invitations in crisis, mirrors in conflict. When your lover becomes your lesson, your grief becomes your initiation. Your resistance becomes your doorway. You are no longer a passive sufferer of life's circumstances. You become a participant in its deeper unfolding. The law of correspondence, for instance, changes how one sees conflict. No longer simply projecting blame outward, the seeker understands that outer conditions mirror inner terrains. A discord at work is not just an organizational problem. It is often a personal echo, a signpost pointing to some dissonance inside that seeks resolution. Healing becomes less about controlling the external and more about refining the internal resonance. In this way, life becomes not a battlefield but a feedback loop. The law of vibration begins to manifest through conscious language and thought. What we utter, we energize. What we think repeatedly, we entrain into form. This is no longer mystical suggestion. It is increasingly validated through the science of neuroplasticity and quantum observation. But the ancients did not need microscopes to know that a thought repeated becomes a structure in the psyche. This realization fosters sacred discipline in communication. Gossip and cynicism lose their allure. One begins to speak like a builder, not a demolisher. Words become spells, and silence becomes a sanctuary. The polarity of life is no longer seen as opposition, but as dynamic tension necessary for creation. Rather than swinging uncontrollably between extremes, work and burnout, hope and despair, love and resentment, the balanced soul begins to hold both poles simultaneously, like a tuning fork vibrating with both longing and presence. This inner synthesis manifests as emotional maturity, not in denial of feeling, but in mastery of its navigation. The shadow is not expelled. It is honored, brought into the council of the self, given voice but not the throne. Rhythm expresses itself as patience. We learn to trust the seasons not just in nature, but in ourselves. There are winters of the soul when nothing grows, and this is not failure, but gestation. Spring cannot be forced. The knowledge of rhythm brings an end to the tyranny of urgency. It teaches the virtue of timing, which is deeper than speed. We no longer strive to bloom before we root. We trust the process, even when the shape of our life seems formless. Mentalism, the most subtle and perhaps most radical principle, shifts the locus of power inward. Reality is not just what happens to us. It is what we project, magnetize, and shape through consciousness. This is not solipsistic fantasy. It is participatory creation. We become aware of how our expectations, assumptions, and deep beliefs sculpt the field around us. Meditation is no longer a spiritual hobby. It is a tuning of the instrument through which the cosmos plays. Every act of inner stillness realigns the outer weave. To live these truths is to slowly dismantle the illusion that the sacred is somewhere else. The unsealed knowledge pulls heaven down into the gestures of ordinary life. It urges us to build temples in time, through how we eat, how we speak, how we respond when no one is watching. Every morning becomes a rite of renewal, every meeting a test of grace, every setback a whispered teaching in disguise. This integration does not mean perfection. It does not create a life free from pain or error. Rather, it creates a life informed by meaning, a life in which even pain is woven into a greater tapestry of awakening. The real world, so often spoken of with weary resignation, becomes a training ground for sacred embodiment. The teachings are not kept in books, but carved into our habits, our rituals, our loves. In practical terms, it changes relationships. One listens more deeply. Judgment softens into curiosity. Control yields to presence. Conflict becomes opportunity. Parenting becomes priesthood. Business becomes a vehicle of dharma, not just commerce. Art becomes invocation. The line between spiritual and secular dissolves, and in its place arises a third space, the numinous mundane, where divinity speaks through dishes, through commutes, through Monday mornings. This is the deepest implication of what has been unsealed, that we are not waiting for salvation. We are reactivating remembrance, and through that remembrance, life becomes the ceremony it was always meant to be, the unsealing of the soul. And now we stand at the edge of the final threshold, not as the end, but as a great beginning that quietly emerges when we have traced the arc of ancient knowledge back into the marrow of our lives. These truths, once buried beneath centuries of dust and dogma, now stir again in the marrow of consciousness, not as echoes from a distant past, but as blueprints for a future that remembers what the present has forgotten. To conclude this journey is not to close a book, but to awaken the reader inside the story. You are not apart from these mysteries. You are their vessel. The breath you carry is the same breath that whispered through the caves of Eleusis, through the chambers of Alexandria, through the cloisters of seekers who once protected these truths with their lives. You are their descendant not by bloodline but by resonance. And in remembering this, something ancient reclaims you. The unsealing was never just about historical recovery. It was never about glorifying the past or indulging in esoteric nostalgia. It was about reactivating the architecture of meaning. It was about piercing the veil of forgetfulness that has come to shroud the modern soul in illusions of separation, randomness, and scarcity. It was about recognizing that there is no such thing as just the way things are. There is only the dream we have collectively consented to dream, and the invitation to dream again, more awake, more whole, more rooted in wonder. In this moment, this quiet, golden pause between the final words and your next breath, the deepest call resounds. Not to seek more knowledge, but to embody what has already been known. To allow the unsealed truths to etch themselves into the architecture of your attention. To live as if the universe were indeed intelligent, conscious, and intimate. As if every moment were an oracle. As if your life itself were a scroll of sacred design waiting to be read from within. Transformation is not a performance. It is a shedding. It is less about adding and more about remembering. The phoenix teaches this in fire. Persephone teaches this in shadow. The labyrinth teaches it in silence. And now, so must we teach it, through how we rise after a fall, how we carry grief without closing, how we listen without rushing to reply, how we plant seeds with no demand for immediate bloom. The teachings will not protect us from pain, but they will reveal that pain, too, can be consecrated. That even our wounds can become wells of wisdom, that we need not avoid the dark, for it is there that stars are born. The transformational call is not loud. It is not an alarm. It is more like a heartbeat, a pulse within a pulse. It speaks in the language of subtle courage. The courage to walk into your own depths and not turn away. The courage to forgive again and again, even when it seems foolish. The courage to sit still long enough to see the pattern beneath the chaos. The courage to live not by reaction, but by inner alignment. So what now? Now you walk as a keeper of the flame. You carry what cannot be proven but is profoundly known. You walk not ahead of others, not behind, but beside. As a mirror, as a reminder, as a living testament to the fact that nothing, no matter how long buried, is beyond resurrection. May your days unfold as pages of revelation. May your presence soften the spaces you enter. May your thoughts become seeds of healing. May you remember that the knowledge you seek has always been within you, folded like light in the prism of your being. And may the unsealing continue not just in texts or temples, but in gestures, in choices, in how you hold the gaze of the world. For you are the living continuation of what was hidden. You are the scroll now opened,